The reptile keeping hobby is under attack. Around the world, new laws and legislations, ranging all the way from outright bans to overly restrictive legislations, are being proposed by groups who want to stop us from keeping the pets we love. And chances are that you aren't even aware that this is happening. The European Union is currently looking to introduce a so-called positive list, a short list of approved pet species while everything else not on that list is automatically banned. Similar efforts to restrict our hobby are currently happening in Canada, the UK, the Netherlands, Norway, and several other countries. Earlier this year, we had a very close call in Sweden, where it looked like reptile keeping would be entirely destroyed because of new impossible regulations. You will soon realize that although the specifics of the proposed legislations vary from country to country, the underlying issues and the misinformation and prejudice we're fighting against are the same no matter what part of the world you're living in, so we have a lot to learn from each other's situations. As reptile keepers, we have to be aware of what is going on so we can work together to protect our hobby. Today I have invited Tony Wigley from the organization Responsible Reptile Keeping to talk about the challenges our hobby is facing. He works full-time advocating for the rights of reptile owners by networking with pet-keeping advocacy groups around the world, spreading information about our hobby, and debunking misinformation and propaganda spread by animal rights activists. Me and Tony met in person earlier this year at the Swedish Herpetological Association's annual meeting, during a critical moment where reptile keeping in Sweden was nearly shut down by proposed changes to the animal keeping regulations. The proposed changes were actually redacted, thanks to the wonderful engagement from hobbyists and organizations, and we will get into more details on that later, but our hobby is still balancing on a knife's edge. The rest of this video will be in a podcast format, so if you don't want to sit down and watch for a full 2 hours, feel free to instead listen to it while doing the laundry, being at work, playing a video game, or feeding your animals. I know the average YouTube viewer has the attention span of a squirrel or something, but please listen to this video all the way through because this is really important. This video has a much wider target audience than my normal videos, so if you've never been here before, hi, my name is Emmanuel and welcome to Tropical Tutorials. I usually make comprehensive tutorials on poison dart frog husbandry and how to set up and plant bioactive vivariums, so if you want to learn more about that, feel free to subscribe to the channel and check out some of my other videos, but you really don't have to. With that said, here's my conversation with Tony Wigley from Responsible Reptile Keeping. Okay, hi and welcome to this video. Today we have Tony Wigley from Responsible Reptile Keeping here. Hello Tony, how are you doing today?
Oh, we're very good. Thank you for having me.
Great to have you here. I'm not really used to doing a podcast format. I have done one podcast in Swedish and that was a very long time ago, so this is going to be quite interesting. But would you mind just giving us a quick background to yourself? How did you get into reptiles and how's your journey looked?
As you said, I'm Tony Wigley from Responsible Reptile Keeping. I'm one of the co-founders, and Responsible Reptile Keeping is largely a media organization that aims to correct all of the BS and the misinformation and propaganda that you hear about reptile keeping. And it's quite an important job that we'll discuss more about later. But part of the interesting backstory to responsible reptile keeping is how I came to be in this position in the first place. And so that takes us back to the late 1980s when I don't think you were born.
Absolutely not.
Okay, well, I'm old. So when I was about 15 years old, this was the late 1980s, I managed to get a job at what was then the largest reptile house in Europe. So my very first job and my very first experience with reptiles was working at this enormous reptile house where we had thousands of animals and sometimes tens of thousands in the breeding season. And we had hundreds of different species, and it was all the cool species that everybody wanted to keep. We had all of those animals. And so, as you can imagine, this reptile house it was in the Midlands in England was the center of the universe for reptile keepers from all over the world, but certainly from all over Europe. And everybody who knew about reptiles, all the experts, all the professionals, all the breeders would come to this reptile house. So I was very lucky. I got to meet all of the world's greatest reptile keepers in the 1980s when I was 15 years old and I didn't know a anything. I shouldn't really have been allowed in the same room as these people because I didn't know as much as they did. But because I worked there, I got to meet them. We got to go out for drinks, and we got to talk to them about reptiles. So I very quickly became very knowledgeable and quite well known in that kind of reptile keeping circles. So that's how I started. And then from there, what happened was that the people who ran the reptile magazines back then wanted me to write magazine articles for them because I was working with all these cool animals, meeting all these cool people. So they asked me to write some magazine articles. So I began writing magazine articles for reptile magazines and also for pet trade magazines. And from there, it became important for me to be up to date with everything that was happening in the reptile world. So I essentially became a journalist writing about reptiles and writing about the reptile pet trade for all of these different magazines around the world. And so, because I was essentially a reptile journalist at that time, part of my job was to keep an eye on what was happening with the animal rights campaigners who wanted to ban everybody from keeping reptiles. And that was becoming quite a big thing in the late 1980s and early 1990s. The people who wanted to stop reptile keeping just when reptile keeping was becoming very popular. Before that, it had just been a few nerdy, strange people who liked snakes and lizards. But then in the 80s and 90s, keeping and breeding reptiles became very popular. And so people wanted to close us down. And so the campaigns that they were using to try to close down reptile keeping became news that I would write about. And I became involved in uh, with some of the people who were running organizations that were trying to protect reptile keeping. So that's kind of how I got started on this journey. I started as a reptile keeper and a breeder and an enthusiast, but quickly realized that unless we work to protect our hobby and to do things the right way, then we would risk our hobby being banned or restricted. And so I realized that communication and media was a big part of the problem. We were looking around, we were seeing many magazine articles and TV programs, and when social media started, seeing all of this BS and misinformation on social media a lot. And I realized that that was the core of the problem. All of the problems that we have as reptile keepers, whether it's learning how to do something, people doing stuff wrong, or legislation, or campaigners campaigning to close us down, all of these things happen because of misinformation, disinformation, propaganda, and lies being distributed largely nowadays on social media. And we knew that we had to do something about that. We knew that if people only get to hear one side of the story, if they only get to hear from the people who say that we're doing things wrong or that it's bad for conservation or any sensationalized news story, if that's the only thing you hear, then that's the only thing you believe. That's the only thing that you can understand. And so our job is to provide people with better information, to give them a better education, and to tell the truth about reptile keeping to set the record straight. So, in a nutshell, that's 40 years of my experience working with reptiles to come out at the other end with responsible reptile keeping. And as you can imagine, there's a lot of detail to discuss about that.
Absolutely, and I think we're going to get into quite a lot of that today. We have many
Yes.
different interesting and horrifying situations to take a look at
Yes.
today, we could say. Just a quick question: do you happen to have any favorite reptile species that you've encountered throughout the years of being in this hobby?
Do you know that's really difficult because I have kept many, many different species. And when you have access to that many animals, and if you wanted to keep them, you could, then it's difficult to choose just one. But if you ask me for some of the most interesting animals that I've ever kept or wanted, the first thing that stopped me in my tracks was Sanzinia, Madagascan tree boas.
Oh,
They
yeah, right.
they just honestly, the first time I saw those, I was truly smitten. Also, white-lipped pythons are another species that I really like. My favorite animal is a little helmeted gecko from Madagascar. It used to be called Geckonia chazalier, and now I think it's called Tarantola chazalier. And they're just fantastic. They're about so big, they're beige and sometimes with some markings. And I really enjoyed breeding those. But as a frog guy, um, I should tell you that the most expensive reptile I ever bought cost me about £5,000. Sorry, not it wasn't even a reptile; it was an amphibian. Cost me around an estimated £5,000, and it was an albino horned frog,
Oh,
Ceratophrys ornata. And
are they
this
that
frog,
expensive? Or it was new back
not
then? Or...
now, but this was the first one that came in the country, as far as I know,
Oh,
anyway. So I was unpacking a
right.
shipment for my boss, and I opened this container, and in this container was a really small Ceratophrys ornata, but it was albino. It was bright yellow and bright green, and it looked like it had been colored with fluorescent highlighter pens. And my eyes popped out of my head, and I said to my boss, I want this frog. And my boss said, "You can't afford that frog." And I said, "Well, I'm not leaving the room until I own this frog, and so we need to come to a deal." And he says, "You can't afford that frog." And I said, "Well, you know what I earn because you pay me, and you know all the animals that I own. So tell me what I need to do to own this frog." So he took from me all of my leopard geckos, all of my corn snakes, all of my bearded dragons, and he also made me pay him. I can't remember how much it was, but it was a big chunk of money every week. And then when I worked it out, how much I'd paid him for this frog, if I worked out how many babies my corn snakes and
Yeah,
bearded dragons and leopard geckos would have bred and I could have sold them, I worked out that it was over £5,000, which is about, I think, €6,000. On
that is
so,
quite a purchase. And
and it
I
was
don't.
also stupid because, of course, Ceratophrys ornata, they have many, many, many babies, and within a couple of years, that frog was worth about €5. So, having spent, and mine was a male, so it didn't even have any babies.
Yeah, I see what you mean. I was about to say I haven't really kept up with how much albinos cost, but I can't imagine it was a very good long-term investment.
And and this is one of the things that we should discuss about reptile keeping is that quite often reptile keepers get hassle from local authorities or governments or from CITES or from politicians because they apparently treat animals like a business and treat animals like a monetary commodity. But very, very few of us actually make any money from our hobby, from our animals. Many of us in the 80s and 90s tried to become successful reptile breeders and make lots of money from our reptiles. And none of us did. We all tried very hard to make a career from breeding reptiles, but it's very difficult because we like our reptiles so much that when we have some money, we just buy more reptiles. And so
Of
it's
course.
not always easy to make money from breeding reptiles, as we know.
Yeah, that's a very relatable situation. But to get back to what we were going to talk about today, what threats against the hobby exist in our society today in different parts of the world? We can spare the details for later because we're going to get really into some specifics then. But
Yeah.
if you want to just give a brief overview, sort of point at the world map, basically, what's going on?
Well, there are many. And in fact, when I say there are many, I mean that wherever you are in the world, there will be an organization or someone trying to stop you keeping reptiles. There are, in some countries, the organizations are very big and very powerful. And in some countries, the organizations are small, but they still have power. And the reason they have power is because quite often in certain countries that there's nobody working to solve the problem to address the misinformation. There's nobody working with governments in smaller countries and other areas to address the misinformation and the campaigning that's been done by the people who want to curtail reptile keeping. So just to look at some specific countries in Sweden, let's start there, of course. You'll remember that when we met, It was time to discuss the L80 proposal that tried to increase the amount of legislation and requirements for reptile keepers and amphibian keepers to the point where they would have been so ridiculous that most people wouldn't have been able to keep them. And if I remember correctly, you'll have to correct me if I'm wrong, but one of the things that they said was that you were not able to feed insects to your animals.
Exactly. Not able to feed live insects to our animals. Uh, y-
So you
yeah,
wouldn't be able to keep frogs anymore.
absolutely not. Technically, I think springtails are not actually insects, and same for isopods. But I think that tells more about the stupidity of the proposed legislation rather than uh, the actual possibility of keeping animals. We're definitely going to get more into the Sweden situation later. I think we have some other things to discuss first. But that was a really close call we had earlier
Yeah.
this year, and we were all extremely worried that that was going to be the end of the reptile hobby for us completely. I was going to make a video then about it back then. Then the suggestions ended up being uh, taken back to be reworked, and eventually we're going to have to fight a similar battle again, probably. Um, but more on the Sweden situation later. But that truly made me realize how much of a knife's edge the hobby is constantly walking on. It's no joke.
And we should be clear that many times that the proposals that are put forward can be fought against. But if we're unsuccessful, then those proposals can go forward and become legislation. And that's happened in many parts of the world.
Exactly.
For example, let's talk about Spain, where, if you can believe it, the ball python or the royal python. What do you call them in Sweden?
We call them king python, so I guess royal python.
Royal
Um,
pythons, king
but
python.
but ball
So
pythons make sense.
in Spain, ball pythons, royal pythons are banned completely, which is crazy because they're the most popular pet reptile in the world. Apparently, is it 46% of reptile keepers around the world have a ball python? Have a royal python.
Wouldn't
And the
surprise me.
reason they're yeah, the reason they're banned in Spain is because someone did a risk assessment to find out if ball pythons could become invasive in Spain. The ball python from Western Africa in
Sure.
Mediterranean Spain. And it's crazy. When we think about this, it's crazy. Of course, that can't be true. But this risk assessment said that that could happen. And of course, when the risk assessment came out, when the report came out, everybody laughed at it and said it was ridiculous and forgot about it. And they put it in a drawer and they forgot about it for maybe 3 years. And then 3 years later, Spain had a new government, and somebody in government in a position of power found this report and thought, this is a good idea. Then we can ban ball pythons because they'll become invasive. And this person was an animal activist. Yeah. So they found the report, and even though everybody had said it was ridiculous, they still used it to ban ball pythons. And so that's bad. And as you can imagine, everybody who keeps reptiles in Spain was absolutely outraged about this. And so the Spanish Herpetological Society got together and they raised a little bit of money and they took this new law to court, to the Spanish High Court. And they gave some very good evidence about why this report was rubbish, about why the law was unfair. They had expert witnesses, they had lots of science on their side, and they made a very, very good case for this law to be thrown out. And when they finished the court case, everybody thought that they would win. But at the end of it, the judge still decided to keep the law in place. And the reason he gave was because it should be kept just in case all of the things that the animal rights campaigners were saying were true, just in case. There was so much noise and so much campaigning from the animal rights campaigners that the judge just couldn't turn it over. He had to listen to them. So now in Spain, ball pythons are still banned. You can't keep them. But we know that everybody still does keep them. In in Valencia, one of the regions in Spain, they did a freedom of information request to the government, and it was found out that only 7 people had registered their ball pythons. Every ball python keeper was supposed to register their ball python, and only 7 did. And so I think that there are very many people in Spain still keeping ball pythons that are not registered. That would be my guess. In fact, it's not even a guess. I know it for
That's a pretty
certain.
good guess. Yeah, for sure.
Yes, it is.
That is quite a strange situation. But on the world map, who has to be nervous right now about current things going on?
Well, honestly, the whole of Europe. The whole of Europe is facing potential legislation from the EU Commission, and they're facing it in 3 different areas. So the first one is that the EU Commission is looking at the possibility to impose what we would call something like the Lacey Act, which is what happens in America, they have in America. So what the Lacey Act is let's imagine that you live in America and you own a very rare gecko from Australia. And if Australia say, hey, we've never imported that species of gecko, in America, might not previously, it might not have been illegal for you to own that gecko because you have paperwork for it. But with the Lacey Act, America can prosecute you for the laws in Australia. So let's imagine that happened in Europe. Let's imagine that so all bearded dragons apparently have never been exported from Australia legally. It is possible that if a Lacey Act appears in Europe, that all bearded dragons would become illegal. So that's the first thing that's being discussed in Europe, something like the Lacey Act, where you can be prosecuted in one country using the laws of another country. The second thing that's being investigated is the opportunities for government to reduce the amount of illegal wildlife trade. And that sounds like a very good thing. Yes, reducing the illegal wildlife trade, we would agree with that, I assume. However, the organization that's looking at this project is framing it as a reduction in all exotic animal trade. So instead of just looking to reduce the amount of illegal trade happening, the way that they're performing their consultation, the questions that they're asking, and the language that they're using would aim to reduce all exotic pets. So that's a considerable worry. But the worst problem that we face in Europe, the biggest problem that we face, is something called a positive list. And if you live in Sweden, your next door neighbors in Norway already have a positive list. So some of your
Exactly.
viewers might know what that is, but I'll explain it now for the ones that don't. A positive list is exactly the same and is often also called a white list. And a white list is, as you might imagine, the opposite of a blacklist. A blacklist is a list of things that are not allowed. So a white list is the opposite. It's a list of things that are allowed. And when we have a white list or a positive list of animal, this is a list of animals that you're allowed. And everything that's not on that list is not allowed, is banned. So in Norway, they have a positive list of reptiles that is just 19 species and no amphibians. In Norway, they're allowed to keep 19 species of reptile, and everything else that's not on that list of 19 is completely banned, which is absolutely crazy. Because how could you? So, for example, if a leopard gecko is allowed, why is a fat-tailed gecko disallowed? Why would a fat-tailed gecko be a problem when a leopard gecko isn't? If a bearded dragon is allowed, why is a Henry Lawson eye not allowed? It's silliness, and it doesn't achieve anything. In fact, we'll talk about it in more detail, but it's actually a positive list actually causes all of the problems that it wants to solve, it makes them worse. So it causes more invasive species, more welfare issues, more human safety issues, more zoonoses, or more conservation issues, more animals being exported and taken from the wild, more illegal wildlife trade. Positive lists cause all of these problems to get worse. They don't solve them. So why then are people campaigning to have positive lists in place if they make all of these problems worse? The answer to that is because they simply want to stop us keeping animals at any cost. That's why.
Absolutely. Um, Yeah, and there are plenty of really big problems with positive lists, of course, as you are definitely an expert at after doing the work that you do full time.
Mm.
Um, but what are the main consequences of introducing a positive list in terms of what's actually going to happen?
Yeah. Okay. So what we know from all types of legislation that try to absolutely ban something is that it usually almost always makes the problem worse. So the biggest reason that our opponents offer a positive list as a solution is they say that it will stop all of the welfare issues because as far as they're concerned, if you can't keep it, then you can't keep it badly, which is of course true. If you can't keep it, then you can't keep it badly. Um, Now, what happens then is if you have a positive list, then these animals are usually sourced illegally. They're sourced from different countries or from illegal traders, and there's no legislation in place that tells the seller that they have to provide information, that they have to provide help. Also, if you keep an animal illegally, and we know that many people will keep animals illegally in Norway, even though they had an outright reptile ban for many years, it was still estimated that 110,000 reptiles were being kept illegally. Now, none of those reptiles could go to the vet. So that's obviously bad for welfare. You can't take your illegal reptile to the vet in case you get into trouble. So that's obviously bad for welfare. And if let's imagine that I have a really rare frog and I don't know how to keep it very well and it's illegal, I can't come to you and ask you for advice because you might report me to the authorities and then I'd be in trouble. So by banning reptiles, by banning animals from being kept, you're stopping the information flow, you're stopping the propagation of good husbandry, and you're stopping veterinary care. So we know it's bad for welfare. Um, the other reason they give us to ban reptiles and put them and create a positive list is they say that it will stop illegal trade. If you're not allowed to have them, then the trade will slow down. But that's not true. All that happens is that the trade goes to the nearest border and it comes across the border illegally. And if animals aren't being bred because they're not allowed, guess where we get the animals from? If captive bred ones aren't available because they're not allowed, guess where they come from? They're smuggled from the wild. And
Of
so
course.
illegal trade increases. Um, let's imagine that reptiles are mostly banned and you're only able to get them through underground sources, through keepers who do things underground out of scrutiny. Then it's very unlikely that I'll tell you about salmonella. It's very unlikely that I'll tell you about good husbandry. It's very likely that you'll buy an animal that's unsuitable for you. And therefore, all of these risks increase over time if you ban an animal. So a better option than a positive list would be some kind of regulations for animals that are problematic. So, for example, um, slider turtles like Trichemis, they've been a problem in Europe for a while. So regulations to legislate keeping of those is a good idea. Maybe venomous species should be regulated so that only competent people can have them. But by banning them, all you do is create a trade that cannot be regulated, and so all of these problems get worse.
Absolutely. And I think something very important to keep in mind is that I have to translate this to English on the top of my head right now. People always strive to stay in control, and people are very afraid of the things that they don't know about. But when you try to
Mm.
control what you don't know about, then you're really going to come into it's going to cause issues basically. And I think that's really what's happening whenever outside organizations that are not part of the hobby are trying to regulate this, because the truth is that the hobby are by far the people who care about these animals the most. I would definitely argue the reason we have so many animals in captivity is that we are so freaking good at caring for them. Something that one of the Swedish
You,
people said when we last met. And I think that's something important to keep in mind because we are always striving for better animal welfare. It's just that when it comes from people who don't care about the hobby, it tends to not really be optimal in most cases.
you're absolutely right. And this brings me on to 2 points that are important to make about this. So the first one is that positive lists and reptile bans are largely unenforceable because reptiles are kept indoors and you can't see them very often. Yeah. But also how many authorities, how many governments, how many police, how many, people outside the hobby can identify all of the species? How many of them can say whether they're being kept well or not? How many of them can tell me if this is a bearded dragon or a leopard gecko? We know the difference, but the authorities certainly don't. And and you're absolutely right about the competency of private keepers. Think about it like this. All of the advancements in reptile keeping and husbandry and equipment and all of the pioneering in captive breeding has come from private keepers. It's not from zoos, it's not from researchers, it's not from scientists. It's private keepers who have done this work. And the zoos and the conservation projects use the information that we generate to help their projects. Without private keepers, you wouldn't have any herpetologists, you wouldn't have any conservation specialists, you wouldn't have half of the products that we have. Because if people aren't allowed to keep reptiles, why would ZooMed, Arcadia, or Exoterra, or any of the other companies, why would they build equipment and spend lots of money on research and development to create these products that improve husbandry if there's no one to sell them to? So private keeping is really important for conservation, not only because when we breed animals in captivity, that stops them being brought in from the wild, but also because if we keep animals, then we're innovating, pioneering husbandry, and products are innovated and brought to market because we will buy them because we want our animals to do well. It's one of the things that we highlighted recently in one of our videos where a campaigning group in Europe was talking about why we should have a positive list and ban most people from keeping reptiles. And one of the slides on their presentation that they gave to the government ministers said that, hey, these are the species that are problematic in trade. And it says the world's largest python. And it said the Burmese python, and he said that the Burmese python was the world's largest python. Well, there were two things wrong with that. Firstly, it isn't. The world's largest python is, of course, either an anaconda if it's by weight, or a reticulated python if it's
Anaconda
by
is not a
length.
python, but
Well, yeah, exactly. Well, I think he said the world's largest snake. My
okay,
my
right,
apologies.
makes sense.
So the world's largest snake was either an anaconda or is an anaconda or a reticulated python,
Yeah,
not a Burmese python. But worse
absolutely.
than that, the photograph that they had on the slide with this statement was a ball python. So and we know this, even the most basic reptile keeper will know these questions and answers. But
Absolutely.
these are the people who are giving advice to the European government and parliament about reptiles. So how can we trust these people when they can't even make basic statements true? And we have enough evidence to say how much expertise there is in private keepers. And it just blows my mind that they have such a big voice in government when they clearly have no idea what they're talking about. If you want to see that video, by the way, if you want to see that slide, you can go onto our social media, or better still, onto our website or onto our YouTube channel, and you can see that video where the guy stands there in front of that slide trying to pretend that he knows about reptile keeping. And it's just crazy to see.
I will definitely have to check that one out and leave a link to that specific video in the
I'll
description
I'll
because that
send it to
sounds
you. Yeah, it's crazy.
absolutely that sounds really hilarious if it wasn't for the fact that these people are actually making legislation that's going to affect the hobby that millions of people truly like. And one of the things that
Exactly.
I think are difficult to grasp about a positive list, perhaps some of you watching this might keep a leopard gecko or a bearded dragon or whatever, and you think, well, my reptile is going to be on that list, and I can imagine that most reptiles are going to be on it. Um, but you have made your worldwide reptile survey recently. I don't think it's still out, right? Um,
No, we close it for this year. We're doing all the number crunching, and it'll come out again in a couple of years' time.
yeah, okay. But so you are probably the person who has the most statistics out of probably anyone in the world about what reptiles are actually being kept.
That's right.
So out of curiosity, how many species can you expect are kept in, for example, in the US or in the UK?
think there's around. I think for the people who filled in the survey this year, we have around over 900 different species being kept, if my memory serves me well. If that's not true, my apologies, but remembering all of the numbers is difficult. So
Right.
there are about 950 species. Anyway, around about that, just from people who responded to the survey. However, we have survey results from a UK survey run by the Federation of British Herpetologists a couple of years ago. We also have information from a Dutch online platform called Terrafile. And Terrafile is where you can log all the information about your animal and all its sheds and all its feeds and
Oh,
everything else. Um, and so we have all the species from that. We also have the species from another survey in the UK. And using that, putting all of those species together, there were around 3,000 species just just in those databases. We also have another database of animals that was created from price lists in Europe. So we got price lists from round about the 1980s when Britain joined the EU. So by putting all those price lists together, I think we came up with around 3,000 species that were being kept in Europe and traded in Europe since the 1980s.
that's a lot of
So there's a
species.
lot of that's a lot of species. Now, most of those species are kept in very low numbers. What I can tell you is the vast majority of reptiles kept come from, I think it's 7 or 8 different species. Can you name the 7 or 8 most popular reptile and amphibian species?
This is an interesting test. Obviously, ball python, corn snake, leopard gecko, crested gecko. Those
Yep,
should be free.
yep.
Three left. What do we put here? Now
Let
it's
me give
getting
you the obvious one
difficult.
you've missed. I'll tell you the obvious
The
one you've
obvious
missed.
one I
Bearded
missed.
dragon.
Did I not
Bearded
say?
dragon.
Oh, yeah, right. I only said the geckos. Okay. Are the
Yeah.
rest snakes or lizards? Is there even an amphibian on the
Um,
list? Maybe
I
horned
think there's an
frog or
amphibian number 8 or 9. Get which is the most popular amphibian?
it has to be. Is it horned frog or white street frogs?
White street frogs. Yeah.
White street frogs.
A- a- Another one that's recently become very popular, I say recent in the last sort of 5 years, is the Western hognose snake.
Right, makes sense.
That's become very popular. In the UK, at least, I'm not sure about across Europe, but the Horsefields and Hermann's tortoises are very popular.
Yeah.
And there's another species of gecko that breeds very, very easily and has become
Oh,
popular.
morning geckos.
You got it. Yeah, yeah, morning
Yeah,
geckos.
right.
So horned frogs, it's Ceratophorus cranwelli, I think, are second, and the is it Tincturus, the blue? Um,
The blue one is a morph of Tinctorius, yeah. Venerbatus
yeah,
Tinctorius.
Tincturius. That's I think that's third most popular frog.
Finally, some good frogs.
That's
No
a
shade
good
towards
point,
the
well
others,
made.
but dart frogs are
Yes,
superior.
it's a fair point. It's a fair point. So yeah, most of the reptiles that anybody keeps, you know, I'd say it's. I haven't done the statistics for the whole world yet, but in the UK, it was around about 80% of the reptiles being kept were from those species. And we think it'll be similar in Europe and the rest of the world
Yeah,
as
fair
well.
enough.
And the reason those species are so popular is because they're small, they're cute, they're relatively easy to keep, and they don't cause anybody any harm. And it's one of the reasons why reptiles and amphibians are popular animals. They can be kept at home. They don't care whether you go to work or not, and they won't miss you if you go. They're relatively cheap to keep and feed. You can't be allergic to them. So,
That's
there's
great as
many,
well.
and also in terms of zoonoses, these are the diseases you can catch from your animal. There are far fewer diseases to catch from reptiles and amphibians than there are from other types of pets. So, as a mammal, as humans and mammals, it's easier for us to catch zoonotic diseases from mammals than it is from reptiles or amphibians or fish or even
Totally makes
birds.
sense.
So they're a very safe pet to keep as well. So it's obvious why reptiles are so popular, why reptiles and amphibians are so popular. One of the things that our opponents always talk about is, oh, these millions of reptiles are being kept in Europe, millions and millions of them. And we say, great, that sounds awesome. And the reason it sounds awesome is because if so many people are keeping them, and if so many people are breeding them, and if so many people are selling them, then surely that proves that they're an awesome pet. Because if they
Absolutely.
didn't do well, if they all died or were sick or were causing problems, people would go, oh, forget it. I don't want to keep reptiles. They're just too much of a problem. But that's not happening. So everybody's going, cool, reptiles, let's keep reptiles because they're awesome. It just proves how popular they are and
Uh,
why they're popular.
Absolutely. The point I was getting at when asking about all of the species numbers was to just shed some perspective on just the sheer number of species that wouldn't be included on such a list.
Oh,
Because if
goodness.
there
Yeah,
are around 3,000 species in Europe or whatever it was, that's about 2,981 species that are not on Norway's positive list. And I can assure you that some of those
exactly.
species are most definitely kept in Norway by people who keep quiet, and
Absolutely.
that is when you truly lose control of an entire market, when it goes completely underground like that.
There's a huge problem in that if something's illegal, then it goes underground, it's unobservable and unregulated, and you have no control at all. So you won't remember, but Sweden also used to have a reptile ban. Yeah. And Sweden only got rid of its reptile ban when it joined the EU. And suddenly, overnight, as if from nowhere, millions of reptiles turned up in Sweden. Millions of keepers suddenly appeared. You know, they were always keeping those animals. They were always being kept
Of
illegally
course.
because that's what happens. Sensible people ignore stupid laws. That's what happens. And yeah, and the other interesting thing about the species on the positive list is if you look at Norway's positive list, it has some very strange turtles on there, and also some very strange snakes, like the Amazon tree boa. I really like Amazon tree boas. I used to breed them, but I don't think they're the best pet snake. Yeah. So how did those species end up on the list? Well, we know it's because the people who were being consulted about which species were the best to put on the list were the people who were keeping those species illegally, who said, "Oh yes, let's put my species on the list so that they're not illegal anymore." That's how they ended up on there. So there's no science and no sensible reason to be able to guess which species would end up on the list. There is no science to it.
Absolutely. And most of the people watching this podcast type video are probably either reptile keepers or amphibian keepers, in the case of my channel specifically, or people who are at least looking into getting reptiles or something along those lines. So I would assume that most of the viewers probably think that banning reptiles is a bad idea. But if you would just like to show how does the debate look? What are the arguments that our opponents use, and how do we counter them? Why are people
Yeah.
wanting to ban reptiles, and why is a ban not a proper solution to those problems?
Yeah, that those are a couple of big questions there. So let me start at the beginning. What excuses are they using to ban reptiles? So the first one is welfare. They say that all of our animals are badly kept, that they suffer in captivity, that we can't keep them well. So welfare is usually the biggest argument that they use. Um, so the first question we must ask is, does bad welfare exist? And the answer is
Absolutely.
yes. Some people keep their animals very badly, and those people should either be punished or educated. But the vast majority of people keep their reptiles perfectly well. And some people, we've only got to look behind you, keep their reptiles very, very well indeed. Is it fair that because a few people do it badly, and it's only a very few, is it fair that you should be banned from keeping them at all? Well, no, of course it's not. They also say that many reptiles are smuggled from the wild, that are stolen from the wild. How many wild caught reptiles do you own, Emmanuel?
So in Sweden specifically, we actually have a complete ban on all wild-caught animals. So
Yeah,
I think it's up to generation 3 or something in practice. So absolutely zero. Um,
exactly.
in
And
my case.
if we even look at the animals that are kept in the UK, where wild caught animals are still allowed, we spoke to the two big reptile wholesale companies in the UK, and we said, how much of your livestock list is captive bred versus compared with wild caught? And they said that on any given day, any given month, it's usually about 5% of the reptiles they sell are wild caught. And that's pretty good because I can make some good reasons why wild caught reptiles are a good idea. And if you have time, we'll talk about that later.
Absolutely,
Um,
in some cases for
but
sure.
only 5% were wild caught. And we thought, well, that's good. But then we spoke to all the reptile stores and we said, hey, how many of your reptiles are wild caught? And they said, oh, well, we don't buy many of our reptiles from the wholesalers. We buy all of our reptiles, or many of our reptiles, from captive breeders. So the number of wild caught animals in our stores are even less than 5%. So we know that most people's animals are captive bred, and we know that most of
Absolutely.
the animals that are being sold, bearded dragons, leopard geckos, corn snakes, ball pythons, mourning geckos, are just captive bred in huge numbers. So why would anybody want a captive bred one if they're keeping a pet? Most people who buy wild caught reptiles either want to work with those interesting animals and learn how to keep them well and keep them alive and breed them, or they want
Exactly.
to replenish bloodlines in a captive breeding program that they already have. Or
Yeah,
they
for
just
sure.
want an animal that's been imported from the wild that just routinely does well in human care, which is fine as well. Because many of those animals are collected by people in countries that earn a living from collecting and shipping those animals. So that's another good reason to kind of permit and regulate trade in wild animals.
Exactly.
It's a
Permit
resource, and
and
if it can be
regulate is a
done,
great way to put it in many
you
cases.
got it. If it can be done ethically and if it can be done sustainably, then like every other resource in the world, it's an opportunity for people to live their lives. But anyway, that's a much deeper conversation.
Yeah,
So we've
the
talked about
wild caught
welfare.
discussion is very interesting, but just as a breeder, there is just absolutely zero incentive to get wild caught animals, and I think that's just speaks so much about the hobby because when you have a legal hobby where captive breeding is encouraged and people learn from each other, etc., there's just no point. Besides, in some cases, of course, replenishing bloodlines or getting new
Bloodlines, yeah.
species in, of course. But besides that, there's just no incentive to buy any of the animals that I
Yeah.
keep wild caught because it's so accessible and available in captivity and so much
And
easier
better
for the
being
animals.
captive bred, much easier captive bred.
Exactly.
So yeah, I mean, while there is a very small need and market for wild
Yeah,
caught
sure.
animals, pretty much they're all captive bred. So that's a lie. When they say that they're stolen from the wild, that's a lie. Um, they also say, when they say they're stolen from the wild, they also say that they're illegally traded. And is there any illegal trade? Well, yeah, there is some. Sometimes people import stuff illegally.
And they're about to make a
And
lot more trade illegal if they get what they
if
want.
they make a positive list, yeah. So I was speaking to the consultants who were running the project in the EU that was supposed to look at illegal wildlife trade. And I said to them, well, we have a way that would put an end to all illegal trade, almost all illegal trade within, let's say, 3 years. So let's take every animal that's illegally traded, or even every animal that's endangered. All of those animals, pretty much every species could withstand a wild harvest of maybe 10 or 20 animals. So let's even the most endangered species, we could take 10 animals from the wild and give them to knowledgeable, experienced, keepers who know what they're doing. Those people would keep and breed those animals. And once they've bred those animals, then captive bred animals would be available. And then, if captive bred animals are available, who wants a wild caught one? So by
Of course.
breeding the animals in human care, captive bred ones become available, and then all of a sudden the demand for wild caught animals or illegally traded animals becomes largely zero. And what we could also do is there's a worldwide policy in place. I think it's called the Ngoya principle, where if you want to breed an endangered species from, let's say, Nicaragua or anywhere, yeah, you would have to buy a license from Nicaragua, and the money from that license could go to conservation.
For
So
sure.
that way, everybody wins. Yeah.
Absolutely.
And that's how you stop illegal trade. The way
Yeah,
to not stop illegal trade, the way to make illegal trade worse, is to ban them. And everybody said, oh, those frogs from Nicaragua that are really rare that we're not supposed to get. I think I'd like some of those.
for sure.
And that's what happens. So, in fact, this happened with the Borneo earless monitor. So what happened with the Borneo earless monitor was that there was nobody had even heard of these lizards, nobody'd seen them, nobody wanted one. Some people like them, but I think they're a pretty ugly brown lizard that lives underground. So, who likes them? What happened was a building project, a construction project, dug up some of the ground in Borneo, and these lizards popped out. And a few of them were smuggled into captivity. Yeah, because they were available, because people had found them. Then Traffic, the organization that reports on illegal wildlife trade, in their magazine said that the Borneo earless monitor was the holy grail, the most valuable pet on the illegal market. At which point everybody said, "Oh, they're supposed to be pretty cool. I'll have one then." So they basically created a market by exaggerating how important these lizards were. Oh, they're the holy grail of illegal trade. So then everybody wanted one. So then they were smuggled even more. But now that they're bred in captivity, nobody wants a wild one anymore. So maybe
Of
if you
course.
want to stop things being smuggled from the wild, maybe you breed them, in human care, and nobody wants a wild one anymore. So we've talked about welfare. We've talked about stealing them from the wild as wild caught individuals. We've talked about illegal trade, smuggling animals. Yeah. Oh, the other thing about illegal trade, here's an interesting point to cover. So the value of the illegal wildlife trade is said to be around 20 billion US dollars a year. That sounds terrible, yeah? Okay,
Sure.
let's look at that illegal wildlife trade. The vast majority of that pie of illegal wildlife trade is trees. Okay. Most of the rest of it is plants. So we're left with only a small amount of that 20 million that's animals. Most of those that are animals are dead animals. It's skins, it's ivory, it's fur, it's stuff for traditional medicine, it's stuff for bushmeat. So it's animals that are already dead. It's not for the pet trade at all. So let's have a look at the live animals, and it's a tiny little amount of that 20 billion now. The live animals that are smuggled, most of those are for the plate, and or at least many of those are
Oh,
for the plate. They're not
okay.
for the pet trade. Yeah. So then we have to look at the ones that are smuggled from the wild for the pet trade. Most of those will go to Asia, where the laws are very different to Taiwan, to China, to maybe Japan, but certainly Thailand. So they don't come to Europe. So the European positive list isn't going to solve it. Yeah. So how big's this tiny amount now? It's tiny. And believe it or not, most of those animals, the live animals that are illegally traded for the pet trade, most of them are captive bred animals that are CITES regulated, that have never been anywhere near the wild. Yeah, they just have the wrong paperwork. Somebody's either tried to get away with not filling in the CITES paperwork, or they filled it in wrong. And that's still called illegal trade. So how much of a problem is there? It's certainly not 20 billion, but
For sure.
this is the figure that our opponents use when they're arguing for a positive list. There's $20 billion worth of illegal trade. We need to do something. Well, most of it's trees, most of it's plants, most of it's dead stuff. So coming back around to your question, we've talked about welfare. They want to shut us down because they say we can't look after them. We've talked about wild caught animals. We've talked about illegal trade. Now we move on to human safety. One of the things that they say is that reptiles are aggressive and unpredictable, and they might just eat your children. So, how many of the species that we keep are actually dangerous? How many of the species that make up most of the animals are actually dangerous?
Extremely
Hardly
few.
any. Very few. I mean, some of the large pythons have the capability, but even if we add it up, I think it's since 1992, there's only been, is it 19 or 17 deaths in America from large constrictors? There's only been one in the UK that was apparently to a large constrictor, but everybody who knows anything about that situation doesn't think that that's true. It was a 9-foot African rock python. I'd like to think that I could get a 9-foot African rock python, get away from that.
Yeah,
Um,
sure.
and even venomous species, the number of people that get hurt by venomous species is so few. And when we compare that with the amount of people who are hurt by dogs or cats, yeah, the amount of
Horses.
people who are hurt by dogs, horses are really dangerous. They're big animals. If a horse is going to mess you up, it's going to mess you up pretty badly, yeah?
Yeah.
If it steps on you, if it kicks you, if it throws you off, if it bites you, or if it hits you with its head, that's going to hurt you pretty badly. You're probably going to go to hospital. If your bearded dragon bites you, it's not going to cause much of a problem. If your leopard gecko bites you, if your corn snake bites you, you know, it's not even going to be worth putting it on social media. It's not impressive. So, so reptiles are pretty safe compared with most other types of pets. So it's not fair to want to ban reptiles because they say they're dangerous. And the other thing they say about reptiles that's to do with human health is zoonoses. These are the diseases that you can get from animals. So what's the most common disease that you can get from reptiles?
I wouldn't even guess that salmonella is the most common, but I can't think of
Yeah,
anything else.
salmonella is the most common. Um,
And not very common
but
in
you
the first place, right?
exactly, how do you avoid getting salmonella from your reptile? Well, you don't put reptile poo in your mouth. That's the way to avoid it. So if we can avoid that, then we'll be okay. Um, so just plainly washing your hands will solve most of the problem. And again, if we're looking for a risk where diseases that you can get from animals is something that we should be concerned about. The diseases that you can get from dogs and cats are far, far worse than anything you can get from a reptile and far more commonly caught. So again, it's not fair that the arguments that they use are these problems at all a problem. So yeah, there are some animals being smuggled. There are some people who keep them badly. There are some people who stupidly catch salmonella or accidentally. Some people, to catch salmonella, you either have to be very stupid or very unlucky. Yeah.
Yeah,
So,
for sure.
you can catch it, but the problem is so small. I'm of the opinion that if we want to regulate animals, if we tolerate cats and dogs, which we do, yeah,
Yeah,
anything that's less dangerous than a dog should be allowed.
for
Anything that's
sure.
less invasively damaging than a cat should be allowed.
And
And if
that's a
we think
major
we
issue.
should, yeah, it is. It's a major issue. That's where the biggest invasive species, devastation of local wildlife runs into billions of animals worldwide a year. It's a huge problem. So
So,
let's deal with that before we worry about frogs in Sweden. How many of your
for
frogs could
sure.
become invasive where you are? I don't think many.
I don't think they would survive the trip from the floor of my room to the door outside in the first place.
Exa-
They would be
Exactly.
dried up in a corner long before then, for sure. And I also thought that it was interesting. We were talking about the dangerous animal the situation with dangerous animals, and that the absolute majority of reptiles have no chance whatsoever of causing any danger at all to us.
Yep.
But in terms of the few species that do, venomous snakes, etc., I still think that it's interesting to discuss that a ban on venomous reptiles or something along those lines is also not really something that we are in favor of most of the hobby,
Absolutely.
and that there are. What other ways do you think there are to regulate to make sure that no accidents happen with those?
That's a very good question, and it's actually a very timely question because I think it was yesterday one of the articles from the Responsible Reptile Keeping magazine was released on social media, and it was all about the venomous debate. And what we did is we spoke to venomous specialists from around the world. We had a couple of guys from the Netherlands who run an organization called Responsible with Venomous, Torben and Tino, I think it is. We also spoke to a guy in Ray from the USA that produced a film called The Venom Interviews. And we spoke to various people to get their opinions from around the world to see how legislation works. what we realized was that if there is zero regulation in place, if you're just allowed to keep whatever you like, then some people will do stupid things.
Sure.
Yeah, we know that to be true. So, and this is the same for flying an aeroplane. If you fly an aeroplane, there's regulations in place to stop people flying airplanes because it
Absolutely.
could be dangerous. If you have an outright ban on keeping venomous stuff, then people will keep it illegally and then you have no control again. So the best way to regulate dangerous activities is to have what we call enabling legislation. You're allowed to keep this animal that has the potential to be dangerous if you demonstrate a level of competency. And
For
what
sure.
that level of competency is usually, and most importantly, is to prevent your neighbours and the general public being hurt by that animal. In the UK, we have some legislation like this. It's called the Dangerous Wild Animals Act, and it's been in place since 1976. And as far as I can tell, it's the most successful piece of legislation anywhere in the world about anything at all, any topic, because it's the only piece of legislation that I know that's been 100% successful. And what that legislation does is it's supposed to protect the general public from dangerous wild animals like lions, tigers, monkeys, venomous snakes, crocodiles, and bears, or whatever else. And since 1976, not one single member of the public has been harmed by a an animal on the Dangerous Wild Animals Act. And so it's an enabling piece of legislation. And even one of the ministers from one of the politicians from the House of Lords in the UK, I can't remember exactly what he said, but what he meant was, if you want to keep lions and tigers and cobras, and that lion or tiger or cobra kills you, then that's fine. That's up to you. It's your problem, as long as it doesn't kill a member of the general public. And I like that kind of legislation. If I want to go skydiving, bungee jumping, loop the loop in an aeroplane, that's up to me, as long
Sure.
as I don't damage anyone else, you know? And so what the legislation is supposed to do is enable people to keep these animals as long as they can demonstrate a level of competency. And that should definitely be about making sure that the general public are safe. But many people, including me, also believe that it should be about making sure that the animal is well looked after. To be honest, most countries have laws in place that say that all animals should be looked after. And this is something that comes back to the positive list, if I can just squirt round back a little bit.
Absolutely.
One of the reasons why a positive list and bans don't work is because they're unnecessary. First of all, there isn't really a big problem to solve. If you want to look for a big problem, then dogs and cats are big problems. Reptiles are a very small problem. There's probably not a problem to solve, so you don't need to make legislation to solve it. But more importantly, there's already legislation in place to solve all the problems that you want to solve. There's already welfare laws to stop people doing things to animals that, that they shouldn't do. There's already laws to stop people smuggling animals and illegal trade. There's already laws in place that stop these problems. And if the problems are still occurring, then that's an enforcement problem. And we need to enforce them better. We don't need to have extra laws that won't be enforced either, an extra level of laws that won't be
Exactly.
enforced. So the fact that they're unnecessary and the fact that they're unenforceable are the two biggest reasons why positive lists won't work. And this is why the legislation about dangerous wild animals in the UK has been largely successful. But the reason it's been mostly successful is that the trade regulates itself. If you came
Yeah,
to
for
me
sure.
and you said you wanted to buy a mamba, I'd say, Manuel, you're a frog guy. There's a long way for you to go
Totally.
before you can prove to me that you can keep a mamba. And if I
For
sell you
sure.
this mamba, it's going to bite you, and then we're going to have news stories, and then we're going to have legislation. So I don't think I'll sell it to you. And in most cases, that's what responsible keepers do. The
Absolutely.
law itself is a deterrent. The law itself makes people who are thinking about it think about safety and think about welfare and think about public safety. But really, it's the trade itself that does most of the work.
For sure. And I think you put it really well when we last spoke back in Sweden about the fact that we're not apologists for the bad part of the trade. It's only that we think there are far better solutions. And even when it doesn't come to specifically dangerous animals, if there was a way to enforce some type of reasonable sort of background check, I suppose, when buying an animal. Uh,
Yeah,
I always try as the seller to ask the buyer to make sure that they have an enclosure ready, etc. When it comes to dart frogs, it's difficult to set up an enclosure on the spot when you buy the animal.
yeah,
But if there was something like that regulated, uh, probably by the hobby under a mission from a government or board of agriculture or whatever it is, then I think that the majority of the favor, if it was the majority of the hobby, would be in favor of such a check. But it's just that
absolutely.
please don't ban our animals.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, we have this in the UK already, at least for licensed pet store premises. They are legally obliged. The law tells them that they have to provide information about how to keep these animals.
Yeah,
But even if that law didn't exist, imagine that there's no law about selling animals. You can just sell them to anybody. That doesn't make sense either. The trade would always still try to make the customer understand the animal and know what it is they're taking on and make sure that they could care for it. Because if you think about it like this, let's imagine I breed a load of frogs and then I sell them to just anybody and they kill them. Yeah. The first thing it does, it means they're not coming back to be a customer again. Yeah. Because if somebody has a bad experience with their animal, they say, oh, well, this amphibian keeping thing is a bit difficult and it made me sad because it died. So I'm going to go and play fantasy football or join a rock band or do some other hobby instead. Yeah. But if they have a good experience with that frog, with that animal, then they might just come back and buy more frogs and more equipment. So it just makes economic
for sure.
business sense for reptile breeders and reptile traders to look after their customers. But at the end of the day, if you own a frog, whose responsibility is it that that frog is well cared for? Is it the person who sold you? Is it their responsibility? Or is it your responsibility?
For sure.
That's right. So it's in nobody's best interest to care for an animal badly, and some people do, and those people should either be educated or punished. But largely, the trade does a really good job of making sure that people have a good experience with their animals. In the UK, we have two good examples. The first one was green iguanas. In the 1980s, we used to bring in thousands and thousands of little baby dragons that were very cute and lived in small enclosures.
Yeah,
And then by the time they reached 3 or 4 feet and they were little psychos and wanted to kill you and needed enormous enclosures and very expensive equipment, then people didn't like them so much and people didn't want to keep them. And every zoo in the UK was full of green iguanas. And the same happened with Trichemis species of turtles, the slider turtles.
yeah,
When they're this big and they're very cute and they live in a small tank, okay, but then they get to be the size of a dinner plate and need enormous filtration systems, expensive ultraviolet light, lots of smelly water changes, and they stink a lot. So who wants one of those? Very few people. So what the trade did, I think it was the late 90s or early 2000s, the reptile trade got together and said, maybe we stop bringing in those turtles and maybe we sell them a musk turtle instead because they'll have a better experience.
for
Maybe we
sure.
don't sell so many iguanas. Maybe we sell bearded dragons and leopard geckos instead. And
Absolutely.
the trade was in a much better position to solve those problems than it would have been by legislating. So the trade often runs very responsibly.
Absolutely. I think we've been talking for quite a while now about the consequences of, as as you put it, stupid legislation that's unenforceable or unreasonable, etc.
Yeah,
But in terms of what's actually going on,
yeah,
what are the things that people truly have to worry about? We have touched lightly on the EU situation, and we definitely want to talk more about that. So what's actually going on? Is it something that's being investigated, or uh, is has anything been decided, or what's the current situation? How far has it gone?
So with the EU positive list specifically, that's the one that I'm most involved with. So it started out about a year ago when the work stream for the EU Commission was announced. And from there, several of my colleagues were interviewed, and the rest of us had to fill in a survey. When they were interviewed, my colleagues were very annoyed and concerned that the interviewers seemed to be already in favour of a positive list. And when my colleagues expressed their concerns about positive lists and said the positive list wouldn't work, the interviewers were surprised. Oh, you don't like a positive list? I don't understand. Positive lists are wonderful. And so we were very concerned about this. And some of my colleagues, the organisations that they work for, wrote letters to the EU Commission and said, hey, we have a worry here. The people who are supposed to be objective and fair and balanced and proportionate seem to have already made up their mind that they are in favour of a positive list. So the EU Commission said, okay, we've been in touch and we've told them that they must, be more balanced. And then others amongst us were filling in a survey about positive lists. And the surveys were so complex and so repetitive and so badly worded that most people simply would not fill them in. It took us maybe 2 days to produce enough information, to give enough information for this survey for it to be worthwhile. And then from there, we had to help other people with their survey responses because they just didn't understand what was being asked. The only people who really had the time and the effort are the very rich, very well resourced, well staffed animal rights organizations who would fill in the survey to say, yes, a positive list is a good idea. So we had to work hard to make our voices heard. And then for many months, we heard nothing until about 3 or 4 weeks ago when there was a big meeting with the consultants who were talking about the positive list, and they gave their interim results, their interim findings. This is what we have decided so far. And all of my colleagues that sat in that meeting, after the meeting, we said it was the worst, most worrying, most biased meeting we had ever attended. It was like the consultants had never listened to a word that we'd said. The things that they were saying made it sound like a positive list was a good idea, and this made us very concerned. After the meeting, we all decided that we had to make a response, that we had to write to the EU Commission and also to the consulting company and say, look, this is a big problem. And there are many, many issues that you have not addressed that will become big problems if a positive list becomes law. And we've sent off those objections, we've sent off those responses, and now we're waiting to see what will happen next. And the answer is we don't know.
Yeah, sounds quite concerning, that situation.
It
Is there
is. And go on, sorry.
no, sorry, you continue.
It is concerning. And there are many reasons for us to be hopeful that we will stop the positive list. It's certainly not a done deal. It's certainly not guaranteed. But very much like Spain, who thought that they could argue against a positive list, who thought that they could stop the ball python ban, because Spain has a positive list already, by the way.
Oh, they do.
Um,
On all
yeah,
exotic pets or on reptiles
well,
specifically, or
they've made the law so that a positive list is possible, but they haven't been able to create a list of animals. Why
okay.
is that? It's because creating the list is unscientific. They cannot justify scientifically which animals would be or would not be included. Um, the Netherlands also has a positive list right now. Slovenia just got a positive list. Belgium, dependent on where you live in Belgium, you may have a positive list. In some places, if you live on one side of the road in Belgium, you can keep these animals, and if you live on the other side of the road in a different locality, they're banned. It's crazy. So even though we have very good arguments and we're very hopeful that we can stop a positive list in Europe, we can't be sure. We have to keep working, and the political legislative work that's being done is important. but that's only half the battle. And this is something that I would like us to speak about in terms of what responsible reptile keeping are doing about it,
For
because
sure.
what we do is slightly different to the lobbying, legislative advocacy organizations that are in each country. Actually, shall we do that now?
Yeah, for sure, for sure.
So, here's the backstory of how responsible reptile keeping came to be. Because almost every country, at least the big countries in Europe, have an advocacy organization that looks after the interests of animal keepers and breeders. In Sweden, you have Zorf. Have you heard of those?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, so Zorf look after mainly stores and trade and I think breeders as well. But when it comes to legislation, when it comes to talking to politicians, they do an enormously good job and an enormously important job. I should also add that Zorf also support responsible reptile keeping, so we're very thankful to them for that.
Yeah.
Norway have one. They're called NZ. In the Netherlands, we have PVH, who also support responsible reptile keeping. In Germany, we have ZZF. In the UK, we have Repta. And there are also ones that cover the whole of Europe, such as the European Pet Organization. So there are many organizations that liaise with government to advise government on animal keeping, reptile keeping, amphibian keeping, etc. The job that they do is enormously important. They're
Sure.
essentially firefighting units. What they do is every time weird legislation comes out or when proposals are made, like the L80 in Sweden, these organizations put on a cape and they put their underpants on the outside and they fly to action like a superhero. And they work really hard to solve those problems. And they actually do really well if you consider that they have very, very small budgets compared with our opponents, compared with the animal rights organizations who have millions upon millions of pounds and staff, and they have access to politicians that we can only dream of. Our organizations that fight on our behalf do a really good job. They definitely punch above their weight. And they're very successful very often. Not always, as we know, but very successful very often. So, so the work they do is very important, and
Yeah.
in fact, we still do. I'm on the board of Repta in the UK, that is one of these organisations, and the work that they do is really important. But our job as communicators, as media specialists, as journalists, yeah, we could see that most of the problems that we face are caused by communication issues, by misinformation, by bad journalism, by propaganda. So if you imagine that bad laws can only be made if people are misinformed or miseducated, yeah, if people believe the propaganda from animal rights campaigners, if they believe the mainstream news stories, if they only hear one side of the story, that's how these things turn into campaigns. And so we knew as communicators, as journalists, as media specialists, that we could prevent many of these problems from happening in the first place if we did something about that misinformation, if we
For
did
sure.
something about the propaganda, if we told our side of the story. I mean, you've seen it, and I'm sure that many of your viewers have seen it as well. All of the BS. Am I allowed to say bullshit?
Absolutely. Go ahead.
Okay, let's say bullshit, because we've all seen this bullshit online. Yeah. We've all seen bullshit in the mainstream news. We've all seen bullshit on social media. And it makes me mad and it makes me sad when I see it, and I feel like something needs to be done. So we decided that we ought to do something about it. And we worked with Repta for many years and we tried to bolt our communications expertise onto the side of Repta as volunteers. And to be entirely honest, we failed. And the reason we failed is because while we were helping Repta, we weren't working on our day job, earning a living. And every time something came up in our day job, it meant that we couldn't work for Repta. So we couldn't do this job consistently. And it was during COVID when I was talking to my wife about this. And I was complaining again that I'd seen something on social media that was absolute bullshit. And I was like, somebody should do something. It's terrible. Somebody should write a report. Somebody should write to the politician. Somebody should write to the newspaper. Somebody should make a video and put it on social media. And my wife, having heard me say this many, many times and complain about this subject many, many times, she said, Tony, you're always talking about this. It's time to either stop talking or shut the hell, either do something or shut the hell up. Yeah.
Yeah,
So I said, okay, yeah, maybe we should do something. She didn't say shut the hell up, but I'm not going to tell you exactly what she said. But you understand what she said. Um,
sure.
so we decided to do something. So we spent a long time working out what this would look like and how we would do it because we knew we couldn't do this as volunteers. We knew we couldn't do this in a small way. We knew we had to do it in a big way. And the interesting thing about it is that the problems that we face, all of those problems that we talked about earlier, all of the ways that they attack us, the zoonoses, they're going to eat your children, the welfare issues, the illegal trade and the smuggled from the wild, all that stuff, they're the same problems, the positive lists and everything. They're the same problems that everybody in the world faces. It doesn't matter if you're in Sweden, Norway, America, China, Britain, Germany, wherever. It's the same problems, and it doesn't even matter if you keep birds or fish or mammals, they're the same problems. And what we realized is that if we built an information and education resource that told the truth, that told our side of the story, then that information would be available and useful to everybody who face these problems anywhere in the world. And that's why Responsible Reptile Keeping is a worldwide organization, because our information can be used. It's relevant wherever you are. And it's the other
Absolutely.
reason why we've just translated all of our content into many, many different languages using AI. And our AI translations, I think, are pretty good. I don't think they're perfect, but I think they're pretty good.
Yeah, for
So
sure.
this information is now being generated in lots of different languages. So the way we kind of explain responsible reptile keeping and what we do to people and what we do, the way we explain it to people is if you've seen this bullshit online, if you've seen misinformation and propaganda and lies about reptile keeping, and we know that it's causing problems. We know that these are the lies being used by animal rights campaigners to make legislation. So what we're doing is we're trying to stop those lies. We're trying to put our side of the story forward. And I can give you a really good example. So you might have seen online the statistic that 75% of pet reptiles die in the first year. Yeah, it's everywhere. I've seen it on social media, lots. I've seen it in the mainstream media, and it was even said in an EU Parliament meeting that I was at recently. So
Not
this
surprised.
statistic is everywhere. And as we know, it's BS.
Of course.
Yeah, you know instinctively as a keeper, you know that that statistic is wrong. Yeah. Well, we can prove that it's wrong. We looked at the original study. We looked at the original paper behind that study, and I won't go into detail now because it might be a bit boring. But all of the methodology and all of the statistics in there are absolutely false. We think that they're false because the person who wrote that study is a dedicated animal rights campaigner. So we're guessing that that study is false on purpose. We can't prove it, but we're guessing that that's true. Not only that, but we have research studies that are far more reliable that come to different conclusions and different statistics about the number of reptiles that die in the first year. So the 75% statistic is wrong. We have two separate studies run by two separate organizations with very different methodologies that came up with a very similar figure. And that figure was less than 4%. One of them was 3.25%, and one of them, I think, was 3.6%, I'm guessing.
That's
So
very
both of those
close.
studies, very similar figures, for the amount of reptiles that die in the first year is less than 4%. So we can prove it.
Of
But
course.
that 75% statistic is still out there doing the rounds. So what we did is we produced a video that went into some detail about that 75% bullshit, and we gave them our new statistic. So now Every time that 75% number comes up online, one of our supporters go, no, that's rubbish. Here's the truth. And so it shuts it down. We've had journalists get in touch with us and say, hey, we were going to write a story about this. And now we've seen your video and we'd like your opinion, please. So we're managing to close down those problems before they even start. And what we aim to do, and what we're very much doing, is producing content about all the different topics that they accuse us about, tell them our side of the story and our statistics, and to stand up for what's right and to stand up for the truth. And as you said before, we're not apologists for the reptile trade and for bad keepers. Excuse me. We
Uh,
know that some people keep their animals badly, and we're trying to do something about that as well. We recently released a video about reptile obesity. Reptile obesity is a problem. We'd like that to be less of a problem. So we'd like to educate people so that that problem doesn't happen as much. We've released content about salmonella and zoonoses. Maybe don't kiss your reptile after it's been slithering through its own poo. Maybe don't do that, and maybe don't catch salmonella. So we're not saying these problems don't exist, and we're trying to do an educational job to make those problems less of a problem. But we're also calling out the bullshit when we see it, because that, I feel, is our biggest issue. That's our biggest problem. And the more success we have in correcting people and educating people and informing people, the fewer problems Zorf and USARC and REPTA and NZB and EPO and ZZF and PVH will have in their countries. Because those politicians will be sent our videos and sent our reports and sent our magazine articles, and they'll go, oh, right, yeah, okay, I can see the facts now, and this sounds like rubbish, so we won't listen to it.
yeah,
That's
for
that's
sure.
the aim of the game.
Yeah, I think we're going to get back later to what everybody can do to support our cause. But
Cool.
just on behalf of the reptile community. But just a quick point is that I think if we're going to put some shade on the hobby, we are horrible at using social media if we compare ourselves to the animal rights activists,
Oh,
because it's very uncommon that we have any type of content that's targeted at calling out BS or whatever in the same sort of way. We're mostly focused on infighting about different types of husbandry, precisely because we care so much about animal welfare. But it's very uncommon that we try to speak out and reach outside of our own community, which I think is a major problem that has set us up for this situation where we are against major organizations with so many members, so many full-time working people,
yeah.
that it's a very we're making it very difficult for ourselves this way.
You're right, and I agree entirely that that is exactly how this situation has occurred. Our opponents have spent all of their time dedicated many, many years to causing problems, to telling lies about us, to spreading misinformation. That's been their entire job. Our job as reptile keepers and amphibian keepers has just been to work with our animals and to enjoy our animals. Yeah.
Exactly.
And to be honest, that's how it should be. I don't expect every reptile and amphibian keeper to dedicate their lives to this cause and to write to their MP and to, you know, I don't think you should. I think you should enjoy your animals, yeah, and leave that work to us and support us to do it. But you're right. One of the problems that we have in our community is that most of the things that we do don't get publicized. When we do really, really good work, we don't write a scientific study about it. We don't brag about it to Parliament. We just talk about it within our little community. Yeah. When we do something good in our community, nobody gets to hear about it. But also, when we when we argue amongst ourselves, that I think is one of the biggest problems that we have. Um, we might not all agree on everything, but we should at least listen to each other and work together. And
For
instead of
sure.
arguing, be supportive with each other. Um, I don't think that reptile keepers should immerse themselves in all of these problems. If they listen to this podcast, decide that there's a job to be done and support us, that's great. Yeah. But you guys should be doing the fantastic work that you're already doing, keeping reptiles well, learning about reptiles and sharing it
Sure.
amongst yourselves. Um, the only other problem that we've got with social media is people posting stuff on social media that they really shouldn't, that makes us look bad. And we've all seen it. We all know those people who do it. And I would very much like those people to not get the clicks that they get. But getting bit by big retics or, free handling venomous species is sensational and people will click on it. What we need to do is show best practice and show the good side of reptile keeping. And that's what responsible reptile keeping is trying to do.
Yeah, exactly. On the exact contrary to all of the people who are making the hobby look bad, I think every single case of a person making the hobby look good is something that we should strive to do more of. Like I remember a specific reportage in the news a few years ago about a guy and his snakes, and they showed his snake room, and that he was a normal guy. All of the snakes were completely fine with being kept as pets, and that really presented the hobby in a good light. And I think we need to take every single opportunity that we possibly can to show our hobby, to show our passion for our animals, and the fact that nobody cares more about animal welfare than we do. We're constantly looking for ways to improve our care, etc.
Damn right. And did you see some of our recent docu-series? It was a series of short films about reptile keepers and why they keep the animals they do and how important it is to them and the passion that they have. They're only sort of 5 minutes, 7 minutes or something each one, and it focuses on a different keeper, a different species all the time. But it just talks about why these animals are important to them and how much love they have. And that's the
For
kind
sure.
of stuff that really kind of hits upon people. That's the stuff that shows us in a really good light. And we intend to do a lot more of that.
Absolutely. We were talking before about the entire situation in the EU and positive lists about to be enforced all throughout Europe, etc. But I think it would be unfortunate if we didn't touch on what happened in Sweden a bit more in this podcast, because I
Oh,
think it's such a great uh, case study or example to look at, because there are so many similarities between that situation and pretty much every single other thing that's come out. And given that I followed that specific one a lot more closely than I have followed anything else, that's definitely the one that I feel most comfortable talking with or about. So what happened was that we have a regulation in Sweden called L80, which regulates things like enclosure sizes that you can keep your animals in, and it's very old, it's very outdated, it's standardized to the point where it's very ridiculous in some cases. Some very active species don't require that much room, and some less active ones require a ridiculously huge amount of space, etc. There are many flaws in it, and it was time to revise that old document of guidelines that you have to follow. Uh, and what essentially happened is that the Swedish Board of Agriculture were supposed to make a new version of it and brought in people from various animal rights organizations, which had an outspoken goal that, well, we want all animal keeping to be forbidden. But right now we don't have the mandate to do that. So instead, let's make these enclosure sizes completely impossible for any keeper to actually have. So for example, according to these new sizes, a crested gecko, this big, needed an enclosure that's the same size as my bed, 1.5 square meters, which is so utterly ridiculous that I don't even know where to start. Um, etc. But what ended up happening, or well, they also had the very, as we touched lightly on before, very specific requirements that you're not allowed to feed your reptiles or amphibians or whatever with live insects. which was very interesting. And I saw a person in a tarantula group on Facebook directly ask the Swedish Board of Agriculture, what do I do with my tarantulas? And they said, you can feed your tarantulas with roaches, etc. That's totally fine. Because they don't, the LAD document doesn't have anything to do at all with invertebrates. So they cannot tell you you're not allowed to feed invertebrates live to animals, but they can tell you you're not allowed to care for your vertebrates by feeding them with live invertebrates, which was really funny and really stupid. But it was a very interesting situation.
Most of these silly bits of legislation can't be upheld, they can't be enforced.
Exactly.
And part of our job as animal keepers is to point out where these systems fall down and why they won't work. But unfortunately, in some countries, in some cases, they put the legislation through anyway. And if people don't obey that legislation, they then become criminals. And it's not fair of countries and politicians and legislators to create legislation that we told them was bad, that we told them would not work, and then blame people for not sticking with it and make them into criminals. They knew that it wouldn't work. So why did they push it through? I'm glad that the Swedish Parliament had such good feedback from the general public about how much of a problem this was, because that was what stopped this problem. If we compare the Swedish problem with the Spanish problem, yeah, where the ball pythons were banned, the reason it was able to go through in Spain was because there wasn't a massive number of the general public who were objecting. Yeah. In Sweden, the Swedish government were hit with, so many emails and so many
Sure.
complaints, and it went all over the news. And the Swedish government decided, oh goodness, we need to do something about this. It was because such publicity was generated. And again, we should thank Zorf for this, because they coordinated the media that alerted people about the situation in Sweden. Responsible reptile keeping played a part online as well in propagating the information and sending that information out there to many places across the world, not just in Sweden. And one of the things that we did was to say, hey, Sweden, this isn't just a few animal keepers in Sweden who are upset. It isn't just the trade organizations in Sweden that are objecting. This is people from all over the world, specialists, knowledgeable experts who understand animals deeply. We're all watching you now. So
Sure.
it was when the Swedish government had that kind of scrutiny, largely from the work that Zorf did, that made them think twice about pushing this through. In Spain, that kind of public outcry didn't happen. This is what we're hoping to do when there are situations that need the public to get on board. That's what needs to happen. Public need to get on board. Wasn't it true
Absolutely.
also in Sweden that you couldn't interact with your nocturnal gecko during the daytime?
Yeah, there was such a paragraph in the
Such
proposed
craziness.
edition of LAD. Uh, yeah, so the interesting thing that you can probably see throughout the different situations, even though I'm far less invested or knowledgeable about anything besides our own situation, that we had was how they had brought in all of these people from the animal rights organizations
Yeah.
to the group that was supposed to, that they were consulting when they were forming this new document, um, while excluding the Swedish Herpetological Society or Swedish Herpetological Association, and they had SORF, but I suppose they hadn't really listened to them all that much
Well, they
during the negotiations.
they also had a lot of veterinarians that understand reptiles. When I came to
Yeah,
Sweden, I was visited by a guy called Jesper, who's a
great guy.
Swedish vet. He is awesome, and he knows his stuff. And when the LAT proposal came out, when the report came out, Jesper and his colleagues removed their name from the report because they said that this report is nothing like taking our information into consideration.
Exactly.
This report is written from one perspective and has ignored the experts, so we cannot have our name on this. And this isn't unusual. The situation in Sweden where unqualified people have recruited the information from animal rights extremists who have no expertise in keeping the animals, who just have an agenda to close it down, are involved in creating legislation. Now, as a media organization, responsible reptile keeping can help with this and assist the advocacy organizations like ZORF or Repta in the UK or NZB or PVH. What we can do is raise publicity. What we can do is let people know online. And we can also provide resources to organizations and countries who haven't had this trouble before, haven't had this problem, don't know how to deal with it. We have experience from all over the world. We're working with organizations in Canada, America, Australia, South Africa, Argentina, um, Panama. We're working with organizations in most of Europe. So we've kind of seen these situations occur all over the world. We've seen the legislation that's produced, the good legislation that does good jobs, and bad legislation that makes a mess of things. We know how those legislations work. We could give advice and case studies and examples of how it works. So we can support those organizations around the world that are fighting these legislations in their countries. That's what we are. We're an education and information resource that broadcasts the truth to tell our side of the story and also to address the problems that are happening within our hobby from an expert perspective.
Yeah, for sure. Um, yeah, and what ended up happening in our case to wrap that story, I think one of the advantages that we definitely had in the discussion was that not only reptiles were affected, they were also new regulations for pretty much every single pet that's not a cat or dog or
Birds
something
and
that you
rabbits and
produce
yeah,
for exactly birds and rabbits, etc. Rabbits needed 10 square meters, which is the same size as my room, which
yeah,
for my viewers who have watched my collection tours, that's quite a bit of space for a rabbit.
yeah,
Uh, I don't even think it is big enough. I think it's slightly smaller than that. So having the outrage from all of those animals keepers, all of those animal keepers on our side was definitely an
yeah,
advantage. But
yes,
I think it was a great example from uh, how the community can react, and definitely with major help from Sorf and from you from responsible reptile keeping.
yeah,
I don't think it would have been possible without that to get them to
yeah.
retract this.
It needs to be a coordinated effort. That's the important thing. And just to touch on a point that you mentioned. So let's would about enclosure sizes. Is having a big enclosure better?
In many cases, yes, I would
In
definitely say
many
so.
cases, yes, but not in all cases. It's quite possible to have a large enclosure that is so badly equipped and so badly set up that it's not a good enclosure.
For certain.
Yeah. It's also possible to equip a smaller enclosure with everything it needs. And this is one of the problems that we have within our hobby and within our community, that people are trying to push for conditions and standards that only an expert, only a professor, only a biological expert could have. And that really is a problem because there are ways of keeping reptiles, especially some of the more popular species that most people start out with, that are perfectly adequate. It's perfectly adequate to have a bearded dragon or a leopard gecko or a western hognose snake in a modest size enclosure that provides everything they need. We absolutely do have to have a level of entry for children and new keepers to start with.
Sure.
If we only make it so that the only acceptable enclosures are enormous with thousands and thousands of euros worth of equipment, then we won't have anybody keeping them. We won't have an industry. We won't have equipment. We won't have animals being kept. We need to have an acceptable level of essential care that people can start with. And if everybody complains about people starting out at the beginning or, even making slight mistakes, we've all done this and we all need to learn. And we can only teach people if we help them by telling them off they ignore us. And so education is always the key. And this is done through
Absolutely.
a regulated trade full of enthusiastic people who want the best for their animals. But telling everyone that only an enormous enclosure is good enough is bad. In in some countries, they have legislation that says that every snake enclosure needs to be at least as long as the snake. Yeah. So what I want to do is ask any of the enforcement officers who come round to firstly measure my mamba. I want them to measure the mamba and then tell me how big my enclosure must be. I would like them to come and measure my whip snake. I would like them to come and measure my um, salvator monitor and then tell me how big my enclosure should be. Yeah, it's stupid. The length of the animal and the length of the enclosure isn't the most important consideration. Yeah, let's imagine that I have a 1 meter long snake. Let's imagine that snake is a whip snake. How big should its enclosure be? Let's imagine that that snake is a blood python that just sits around all day waiting for prey to come past. Just saying one time snake length for a meter long snake doesn't work. It has to be species specific. So that's my objection to saying that enclosures have to be a certain size.
Yeah, for sure. And I think this is another example of where if we actually had uh, got the mandate to control this within the hobby, which I mean we do with guidelines. If somebody
Mm.
keeps a crested gecko in something smaller than 45, 60 centimeters, 18 by 18 by 24, if somebody keeps a
Yeah,
crested gecko in a size that's smaller than that, then people are probably going to comment that
yeah,
you should have something bigger. But again, if we had a guideline that where they actually asked hobbyists to make some sort of species-specific regulation,
we have that.
I
We
certainly
have
wouldn't
that.
be opposed to that.
We have that. Or at least in the UK we do. In the UK, we have a document that was produced by the Federation of British Herpetologists. The Federation of British Herpetologists is an umbrella organization under which all of the societies exist. Yeah. So the FBH is made up of expert, nerdy, experienced reptile keepers who belong to reptile societies. So you know the type of people, they know their stuff. And what they did was they produced a document that gives species specific guidelines of a minimum enclosure sizes for all of those animals. And of course, for a whip snake, it's different than you would have for a green tree python. You know, it has to be species specific. And that's why having such basic, blunt legislation as one time snake length simply can't work. Firstly, you can't measure the animal. And secondly, it's probably inappropriate. And thirdly, if you don't dress it properly, it doesn't matter what size it is. So by having species specific regulations like the FBH have produced, and it's a very good document, I'm sure we could argue about one measurement or another measurement. I'm sure
Definitely,
if you
there's going to be a lot of
if you
opinions on that.
yeah, if you put 10 reptile keepers in a room and ask them for their opinion, you will get 15 different opinions, you
Definitely.
know? So it won't be perfect, but it'll be very, very good in very, very many cases. So yeah, that's enclosure sizes. We could talk about that all day, I'm sure.
Absolutely, but that's just an interesting way that different governments, or in this case, a board of agriculture. I don't think the government was directly involved, but that different states can try to regulate animal keeping to make it completely
And do
impossible
it
to do it
badly.
legally.
Yeah. Yeah.
And once again, we're always looking for ways to improve the reptile hobby. And
Yeah.
in your case, if I understood it correctly, it was guidelines and not something that has to be
Oh no,
followed, or
these are specifically produced by the Federation of British Herpetologists for other keepers to use. There's no legislation for guidelines for keepers. There are for stores
yeah,
and there are for zoos. Interestingly, the legislation for stores, for reptile stores, is far, far more specific and demanding than the legislation for zoos, which is weird because animals live in zoos for years, whereas in a store they're only there temporarily.
that is very interesting,
It's
for
craziness, but
sure.
you know.
It
But yeah, the
definitely is.
Federation of British Herpetologists recommendations are just for keepers to use. You can go online, you can find them now.
Sounds great. I will definitely look that up after
Cool.
recording this. See if my enclosures meet the standard. Will be interesting.
Yeah.
And we were talking about different situations in the world. Last time we spoke while planning this podcast, you mentioned Canada. What was it that was happening in Canada?
Yeah, there's a couple of things happening in Canada. So Saskatchewan in Canada has a positive list.
Yeah.
It's a region in Canada, and I don't know how long it's been in place, but my understanding is that um, it came in very quickly and there were very few people to object to it. So that was the reason why it was put in place. Um, but also in Canada recently, there was a proposal to create a positive list in a different area. Was it in Alberta or Toronto? I can't remember exactly. Um, but a couple of and this is another good reason why responsible reptile keeping is an effective organization, because we got a heads up, we got a notification from a couple of our Canadian members, and they said, "Hey, have you seen this proposal?" And we said, "No, we've not seen it." And they said, "Well, I'll send it to you. You look at it." So we looked at that proposal, and it seemed on first glance to be all about zoos. So we got in touch with the advocacy organization over in Canada, who they deal a little bit with reptiles and exotic pets, but not very much. And we said, "Hey, have you seen this proposal?" And they said, "Yeah, yeah, we've seen it. It's all about zoos." So we ignored it. I said, "Well, I don't know, something about this proposal makes my spidey senses tingle. So I need to look more." So I looked at the proposal some more, and in the proposal, hidden in language that was difficult to understand, was a positive list. It didn't say positive list, it didn't say white list. All it said was, you are allowed to keep animals from an approved list. So that's a positive list without using the
Definitely.
words. And what we think is that the people who wrote that knew that we would be looking for the words positive list or for white list, and they purposely didn't say those words so that we would miss it. So what we were able to do was alert Pets Canada, the organization, the advocacy organization in Canada, and say, "Hey, we need to keep our eye on this. We need to look at this." And so now we're working with Pets Canada to address that, which will happen after the politicians all go away for the summer. So when they come back, we'll be looking at that. But yeah, they pop up like that all the time. We have to be vigilant, and of course, we can't be everywhere. So we rely on our members to let us know when things like this occur, so that we can take action. And again, it's one of the useful things about having such a large profile, that we've got a lot of members. There aren't enough of us in this office to do this work, but with so many members, they say, "Hey, here it is. Take a look," and that's worked. And what that profile has also done is it's highlighted our presence and our expertise to people who might otherwise have not found us. So the EU Commission, the people who were doing the illegal wildlife trade consultation, found us online and interviewed us about this. And while we were being interviewed, we said, "Hey, have you spoken to the people in Sweden? Have you spoken to Zorf? Have you spoken to the people in Norway? Have you spoken to these people and the Germans and the Dutch?" And they said, "Oh, no, we haven't. Where can we find them?" And I said, We'll send you all of those contact details." So because we were able to open the door, we were able to get other organizations involved as well. So that's another reason having a big profile is very important.
Yeah, it sounds like you're definitely doing a very great job with all of that. And we've been talking for a very long time, discussing many different issues, and it's been extremely interesting. But to try to drag it to a close in the somewhat near future, the last question I have written down is, what can you do? And I think we've touched on many of these, the different possible answers, like don't bring bad publicity into the hobby, bring
Yeah,
good publicity in the hobby, call out BS, etc.
yeah.
And that education always prevails. But in terms of supporting your organization, and of course, if there's anything else that you want to mention, what should a viewer do after listening to this video?
So there are a handful of things you can do, and the first one is, in fact, let me cover it this way. we all know that there is a problem with animal rights campaigners.
For sure. And I don't think people realize how big this problem is until they've had such a close call as we very recently had here.
Absolutely. I would be happy to speak to any of your viewers who would like to go into more detail about the kind of challenges we face in maybe in their specific country or what the likelihood is of problems occurring. I'm always happy to talk on this topic with your viewers. They can get in touch with us via the website and I'll arrange a call and we'll talk in specific detail. Happy to do that. What I can tell you and what you already understand, Emmanuel, is that there is a problem, and if we don't do anything about this problem, we will get we will have a reptile ban, we will have an exotic pet ban, we will have a positive list, we will have legislation that might not ban, but the enclosure sizes will be so large that nobody will keep them anymore. So there is a problem. I can guarantee to you that there is a problem. We can also tell you that that problem is instigated by the animal rights campaigners who use misinformation, disinformation, propaganda, and lies to tell their story and to fill the heads of legislators and journalists and politicians with bullshit. Bullshit is at the root of all of these problems. So if we agree that there's a problem and we agree that somebody ought to do something about it, then we have to ask who should do something about it. Now, I would guess that some of your viewers would want to do something about this problem. Yeah. And this is the situation I found myself in sort of 15 years ago. So you've got three choices. You can either do nothing and let someone else deal with the problem and believe that somebody else ought to put in the funding or the effort to do it. But that would make you a bit of an ass. I think
For
that
sure.
we all have a responsibility to do something about this. Yeah. The other thing you could do is dedicate your life to solving this problem like we have. But if you have a family or a job or school or animals to look after or any other one of those things, you might not have enough time. So the third way to solve this problem is to support the organizations that are doing this work on your behalf. And there are a few different ways that you can do this. So the first way and the most important way is to share our content as much as you can. Our success will be judged by how many people see our content and how far we can spread our story. And you shouldn't just share it in all the groups and with all your reptile and amphibian friends. You should share it with your Auntie Betty and your Uncle Jonathan, because those are the people who don't understand reptiles that could maybe learn something. Yeah.
For sure.
So share our content as much as you can. And the organizations that support us, the organizations that fund us, the way that they measure our success is how much of our content they see online. If they see our content popping up on social media all the time, they go, hey, responsible reptile keeping, they're doing a great job. We'll continue to fund them. So that's important, to share our content as much as you can, to like it, subscribe to our channels. We can see how many Swedish people join and how many Swedish people subscribe. So it'd be nice to see how many Swedish people join
Yeah,
from.
almost all of my viewers are international since it's all in
Oh,
English.
good, even
So
better
so
then.
so it's even better for you.
So we'll just take an international
Though
spike. That would be
though I
good.
would love to see some statistics on how many new Swedish people joined after the incident we had earlier this year.
We
I can imagine
we
it was
did
quite a
see a
spike.
few. Yeah, we had a decent spike. It was very good. So it's definitely worthwhile. But so the first thing you can do, if you decide that you want to do something about this problem, is to share our content as widely as you can. Yeah. The second thing you can do is very easy. You can look on our website and you can see all of the different companies that support us. These are the companies that understand the mission. These are the companies that understand that what we do is important. And if you support these companies by buying their products, that's great news. If you send a message on social media to these companies saying, hey, thank you for supporting responsible reptile keeping, we will support you, that will convince our funders that we're doing a good job. So that's the second thing you can do. But the third thing you can do, and I think this is also very important, is to join us as a member. It's very, very cheap to do. It will cost you about the same as a cup of coffee each month. Yeah. You can spend more than that each month if you want to, but the basic membership is, I think it's €5. Is that true?
Yeah, I think so.
Basic membership is €5. And so for €5, you can join us as a member. That will, firstly, it will give us a little bit of funding to work with, because that's obviously very important. There is so many things that we could do if we had more funding. The thing that holds us back is not having the funding that we need to do all the jobs that we need to do in all of the different countries that we need to do it. But if you join, that helps. But more important than that, it also adds your voice to our voice. We can say
Exactly.
we have 500 members, 800 members, 5,000 members, 10,000 members. The more members we have, the bigger our voice is, and the more people have to listen to us. And not only that, the more members we have, the further our message spreads. So joining us as a member is probably the best thing you can do. It's the most effective anyway.
Absolutely, and I think people in general are, in many cases, very hesitant to sign up to anything that will cost them money. But you know who aren't very hesitant to sign up to things that cost them money and support, well, the animal rights organizations and their members. So
They're
I
very well
definitely think
funded.
it's a very well worthwhile investment to sign up for such a low cost and still contribute to our hobby, because, well, that's what we have to do. We definitely
Yeah,
cannot take it for granted.
the way I look at it, and I've thought about this very philosophically, is that if you care about reptiles, if you want your hobby to continue, and if you want somebody to do that work on your behalf, then we should contribute to doing that work. The big companies like ZooMed and Arcadia and Exoterra, they give us some good funding every single month. The reptile stores and the reptile brands that are slightly smaller give us an amount of funding that's suitable to them. And at the other end, the keepers who just keep one or two animals, and they love their animals and they want to keep their animals, for as long as they can. It's very cheap and easy to support us, and if you can do that, then we will be very grateful.
Yeah, absolutely.
We've
Uh,
we've only been going for less than 3 years, yeah, and we're already building quite a quite an army of supporters.
for
And this
sure.
is important for us because we can't be everywhere online. We can't see all of the bullshit that's online. We can't respond every time, but our members can. If you see BS online and you're a member, you can type into that and say, hey, I'm a member of Responsible Reptile Keeping. This is what they say about that topic that you're spreading lies about. Now we have control of the narrative.
Absolutely. And another thing, moving slightly away from your organization that we will get back immediately, is to also support any local herpetological society that you have in your
Yeah,
country.
for
I
sure.
would argue that most countries where the hobby is relatively popular probably has some sort of head organization and then many local societies
For sure.
underneath that one. And becoming a member in that one is also very powerful against uh, whenever these discussions are being held close to the
And
parliament or
also very,
whatever.
very valuable just in learning about your animals, you
Absolutely,
know?
you get to meet so many new people.
Yeah.
It's
And
really
having
amazing,
access to those kind of expertise.
for
So
sure.
yeah, join your society for sure.
Yeah, for sure. Don't be satisfied with only being a part of a Facebook group or something. There is more to the hobby,
You're
definitely.
absolutely right there.
But back to your organization, I will definitely put plenty of links in the in the description for people to check out. But what are your biggest platforms that you want people to follow you on if they want to uh,
We're actually
see
on
more?
all of the platforms, and this is another good point to make. So one of the problems with reptile people communicating is that they generally communicate in only one way on one platform. We can say that maybe you like a 2 hour long podcast. Maybe this person likes to read a magazine. Maybe this person likes to watch a documentary film. Maybe this person likes to watch a short video. if I make you read a magazine, you won't read the magazine. You won't get the information. Yeah. It's no good us trying to force one piece of type of content to everyone because not everybody likes that content. And maybe we only send it out on Facebook and you won't see it if you only use Instagram or you only use X. Yeah. So what we do, and this is why our job is so expensive and so large, is we have to produce lots of different types of media, videos, podcasts, magazine, briefing documents, blogs, documentaries. We have to produce lots of different types of content. We have to put them on lots of different platforms. And now we also have to do it in lots of different languages. It's quite an expensive job to do. And we could do a lot better if we had more funding.
For sure. Yeah, I think everybody listening to this, I can assume that you are a fan of YouTube, given that you've found this, although I might try to find some place to publish this on as well, if I'm learning from your advice. But I definitely think the least you can do is to go and subscribe to Responsible Reptile Keeping's YouTube channel. Each and every single one of you watching this right now, if you haven't already.
Click that link.
There's a magazine to check out. There's a podcast. There is
Oh,
plenty of
our
content out
magazine
there
is
for you.
free, by the way. Our magazine is free. You can download our magazine from the site for free. It's just there for everybody to read. Just to give you a breakdown of the platforms we're on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube. We're on Substack. We're on X. We're on LinkedIn. And my wife is also. Oh, my wife's got her earphones in. So I think that's all of them. And of course, we've got a website. So I'm sure if you type in responsible reptile keeping to any of those platforms, you'll find us.
For sure. And on that note, I think we have covered everything that we were supposed to cover. How long has the
Yep.
conversation been?
Oh, 2 hours 15.
2 hours 15. That's honestly about what I was expecting, probably.
Yeah. And it's been fun as well. So
Yeah,
just to extend one more invite to your viewers, if they want to receive our magazine for free every time we produce one, and we only produce a handful every year, you can go onto our website and send us a message, and we'll guide you to the link where you can sign up to see that magazine for free. You can if you send us have a look at our newsletter, you'll see a link to that magazine. If any of your viewers would like to talk to me in more detail about the situations that we've discussed in this podcast, send us a message on our website and I'll arrange to make a call with you to discuss it in more detail.
for sure. Now the Mystic system is going off as well. Yeah, free sounds like a really great deal for the magazine, but also becoming a member is something that I can highly recommend. But on
Yes,
that
please.
note,
And you get an
thank you
awesome
so much.
t-shirt as well.
Yeah, that's pretty great. I received mine this morning, custom made with my logo, and then it says Responsible Reptile Keeping Member. Feels good to have one of
There you go.
those
Everybody
for
wants one.
all of the. Feels great to have one of those on all of the national meetups within the community. But
For
on that
sure.
note, thank you so much for coming on this podcast, and I hope that everybody now is more familiar with the situations in the world and what you can do to make a difference to save our
Yes.
hobby. Thank you for watching this
And I,
video.
and I really appreciate you inviting me as well. I know it's a topic that's slightly different to your usual content, but I think it's important, and we really appreciate being invited. And I hope to catch up with you again soon.
Thank you so much. Thank you for watching or listening to this video all the way through, and please consider sharing it to spread the message even further. In the description, I have included links to some of Responsible Reptile Keeping's channels and a few of their videos that I find particularly interesting, but you can find them on pretty much any platform. As we talked about in this conversation, it's important that this message spreads not just within the hobby, but also beyond our own community, so we can truly challenge the misinformation and shift public perception. The first video that I have linked in the description is a great one for you to share with friends or family members, like your Aunt Betty or Uncle Jonathan, who aren't already familiar with our hobby. Thank you for watching, and I will hopefully see you again in another more positive video.